All right, welcome to the Acquivore podcast, episode 6. This is Don Mansfield. I'm joined by Nick Sanders, who's this black box tonight, and Jennifer Townsend's also on the line. Um, Tonight we're going to talk to you about the DoD acquisition structure and contracting authority. Jennifer's going to lead the conversation. But before we get into the meat of the podcast, I'd like to show you a little bit about DoD Acquisition. DoD Acquisition is a federal acquisition training company, and we currently offer 2 courses, one in simplified acquisition procedures and the DFARS course. There are other courses that we can and have offered in the past, such as subcontract flowdown. I've taught that with Nick, and comparative contracting methods. So my number is up here on the screen. Give me a call. You can also send me an email through the website. Check out donacquisition.com. And let me turn over to Jennifer. She'll tell you about contracting courses.
Hi, sorry for no webcam tonight. I don't know what's going on, but there's my website. I'm Jennifer Townsend, and I am the owner-operator of Contracting Courses, and I teach courses on government contracts. Right now, my 2 courses are Clauses and Provisions and Government Commercial Contracts, and working on developing a few more that will be on demand virtually. But that is my business.
All right. Nick.
Oh, thank you, Don. Nick Sanders,
You there,
love
Nick?
it. You got the latest blog article up. That's got the controversial headline. Good job. Apogee Consulting, www.apogeeconsulting.biz, B-I-Z, as you can see. Apogee Consulting's been around for about a decade, a little more, and we provide all sorts of administrative consulting support to government contractors in all industries and all sizes. And as Don is showing you, the latest blog article, I've maintained a blog now going on like 11 years, little more than 11 years, more than 1 million words of blogs in my news archive. Trying to educate myself and my readership on what's going on in federal contracting. And I appreciate the opportunity to continue that tonight. Thank you, Don.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Okay, so back to the subject. Tonight we were going to cover DoD contracting authority. And this issue kind of came up because Nick was confused about, as most contractors are, about the organization of DoD and how contracting authority works. And Jennifer has worked in the Army, she's worked for the Navy, she's worked for the DoD Fourth Estate, so she knows this pretty well. So I'm going to be very entertained tonight because I don't know as much as Jennifer about it, but I know more than Nick. So I can't wait to see the questions that come up. So no further ado, Jennifer, take it away.
All right. So, and I apologize because there's something up with my connection tonight. It's quite choppy. So I apologize for any hiccups that may cause in advance. But we're going to start here with this agency head definition. It's not so much a definition, it's the authority that's given to an agency head. And this is in FAR 1.601. It can be a little bit confusing, which is why I wanted to go through it, because the FAR, as we have discussed, or as you may not know, is laid out as regulations. It's not so much a handbook. So there's like these little snippets of definitions, which hopefully we can put together into more cohesive structure for you in this discussion tonight. So the agency head, as it states here in the FAR, it's the way it states it is, unless specifically prohibited by another provision of law, authority and responsibility to contract for authorized supplies and services are vested in the agency head. The agency head may establish contracting activities and delegate broad authority to manage the agency's contracting functions to heads of such contracting activities. And then it goes on to say that contracts can be entered into by contracting officers, so on. Oh, that last sentence is important too. In some agencies, a relatively small number of high-level officials are designated contracting officers solely by virtue of their positions. Contracting officers below the level of a head of a contracting activity shall be selected and appointed under 1.603. So essentially, we have this term here that we're going to call agency head. And in the civil agencies, departments, I think, I don't know if it's as confusing as it is within DoD, but it gets fairly confusing in DoD. So let's go to the next slide and see what the definitions tell us. So in agency head or head of the agency, this is in FAR Part 2, it's either the secretary, attorney general, administrator, governor, chairperson, or other chief official of an executive agency, unless otherwise indicated, including any deputy or assistant chief official of an executive agency. So in DFARS 202, for purposes of the Department of Defense, there's only 4 executive agencies. And so that's the Department of Defense, which you will often hear termed as the fourth estate. And then you've got the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, and the Department of the Air Force. Also defined in the DFARS definition section, DFARS 202, is this term departments and agencies. And so it lists military departments and defense agencies. The military departments are Army, Navy, and Air Force. The Marine Corps is considered a part of the Department of the Navy. And then it lists the defense agencies. And this is where even in the last 3 or 4 years, there's like 4 or 5 new agencies. So these agencies are growing at a somewhat prolific pace. So these agencies are the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Defense Commissary Agency, Defense Contract Management Agency, Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, Defense Finance and Accounting Service, DFAS, Defense Health Agency, that's one of the newer ones, Defense Information System Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, Defense Logistics Agency, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, Missile Defense Agency, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, the Space Development Agency is a new one, the United States Cyber Command and United States Special Operations Command, United States Transportation Command, and the very last one was Washington Headquarters Service. So these are departments and agencies. So then the question is, are all of these agency heads? Are the agency heads only the executive agency heads? So hopefully we can answer some of that. And that part of why this becomes very critical is because throughout the FAR, there's different approval authorities, and the agency head is in fact an approval authority for certain things. So trying to figure out who the agency head is fairly critical, not to mention the interrelationships of these. Do you guys have any questions or comments so far?
Does the DFARS have a definition of agency head?
No, not separate from the FAR.
Okay.
I don't really have a question. I guess I'll ask a confirming question. When I think of the what used to be called DPAP, now called what, DPC, is that within the fourth estate?
Yes, and we'll answer that actually in this discussion.
All right. So none of these listed departments and agencies are fourth estate agencies, or are they all the fourth estate? And if it's not Army, Navy, and Air Force, then it must be fourth estate by definition. Is that what I'm getting?
Yes. Yeah. So essentially all of those agencies listed as defense agencies are considered fourth estate. Although I'm going to caveat that a little bit because some of them are managed or they're co-managed. I mean, it does get quite confusing because say for instance, the United States Special Operations Command, I think that is co-managed to some degree by the Army, and so the Army has a little more sway over it, but it is still a fourth estate in terms of the flow of procurement authority.
Okay, cool.
You know
The
how
only
in
thing I'm
some,
sorry, John,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was going to ask,
The only thing
I've seen the term direct reporting units in like DoD instructions and stuff. You know what that is? Like they'll
Yes.
say, okay.
Yeah, direct reporting units is when it is a direct reporting vice matrix, and this is where it becomes very, and this is what took me so long just to even update these slides, is because at some point I actually went through and I read the chartering instruction for all of these fourth estate agencies. There was less of them at that point in time, and the reason I did that is actually go back a slide. Is it one slide? Yeah, because what's very interesting to me about this is it very clearly says authority and responsibility to contract for authorized supplies and services. It does not mention construction. And I have a theory that still has yet to be proven, but it has yet to be disproven, but that construction is a separate authorization. And some of the chartering, and that's part of why I was reading all these chartering instructions, is because some of the chartering instructions very clearly mention construction, and most of them do not. And then in the actual statute, like statutory authority is given for facility support and construction to GSA, and then it's also given in Title 10 to the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and to the Washington headquarters services, but it's not given necessarily to anyone else. And so when agencies, not agencies per se, but when contracting offices start to dabble in construction, my assertion or my thought is they don't have the authority unless it's been clearly redelegated to them by one of the statutory construction agencies. But this is how I went down this rabbit hole in the first place. But it's interesting. It does not say construction in this definition. So if you go to the next, back to the next slide. Yeah, so I read much of the chart, and each of these have a different chartering instruction, and they're all similar except for what they're chartered to do. But and that's where I went back to how some of them are co-managed, and so like it might be they use these terms much more so when you're in the straight up military, but they call them OPCON, ADCON, and TACON. So where you're like under the control of someone operationally or under control of someone else administratively, and you might be under control of someone else for tactical control or whatever. And so so that's how you end up sometimes with these, like, are you under the direct control of someone, or are you under the tactical control of someone? And some of these agencies get into similar situations. Like Transcom is a unique one. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, where's DoD education activity?
Well, I'll show you. But Transcom, before we get to that one, because we'll go ahead a few slides, but Transcom is a good example because the United States Transportation Command, it is a command, but then it's comprised of three separate elements, and it's comprised of like the air portion of their transportation, which is actually under the Air Force. And then the sea portion of transportation under Transcom is the Military Sea Lift Command. And then the land portion of Transcom is under the Army. And so you end up with like these different again, like these matrixed organizations. So it can be quite interesting and confusing. So let's go ahead to the next one so we can show where the other stuff ends up. So before we get this should start answering some of Nick's questions about where DPAP or now DPC fits into this. So the head of the agency Yeah, this is the DFARS definition. Sorry, Don, there is a definition in
Okay.
DFARS. So the agency head in the DFARS definition says for DoD, it's the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Army, the Secretary of the Navy, and the Secretary of the Air Force. And then this part is important, which is why I put it in italics and red. Subject to the direction of the Secretary of Defense, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and the Director of Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy, the directors of the defense agencies have been delegated authority to act as head of the agency for their respective agencies. And so, except for such actions that are by terms of statute must be exercised within OSD. So this is the definition as of today. Although the position of Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics no longer exists. I guess it was about well, it's probably a little bit longer, about 4, maybe 5 years ago, they started talking about doing away with AT&L and coming up with these kind of splitting it into these two separate functions. And the note there at the bottom, per the Department of Defense Directive 5135.02, which was dated a little less than a year ago, and was issued simultaneously with DoD Directive 5137.02, the position of USD AT&L was canceled or eliminated, and it's now been replaced with kind of two separate positions, one of which more or less existed already, but now it's a different fashion. So these two positions are the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, as well as the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And
Nick raised his hand.
Okay, go ahead.
I didn't want to interrupt because I'm learning so much, but this is the obvious question. We're looking at the DFARS, right? Definition of head of agency, and it's no longer valid. You're saying right here, effective 15 July, it was officially changed, but the DFARS haven't changed. What are they waiting for? Is there an open DFARS case? How hard would this be?
Actually, isn't there other parts of the DFARS that do have the right term?
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Why? It's like malpractice. How is this not acquisition malpractice not to have updated this?
Well, it gets worse than that. That's part of why, like, I had actually told Don and Nick that I would have these slides to them a little bit sooner, but then it's because I was looking to see the more updated stuff and I couldn't find it. And so in theory, there should be a very clear charter, because under the USD A&S, there is now these two new positions, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition, so the ASDA, and then there's a second position, which is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment, so the ASDS. And so in theory, there should be some sort of chartering language or some clear redelegation from the USD A&S to the ASDA and to the ASDS. But I could find no such clear chartering guidance. I did find go ahead.
Right, Jennifer. Let me dump on that a little bit, because the one place where chain of command would not need to be clear would be the Department of Defense, right? That'd be the one place in the executive branch where they wouldn't care.
Yeah, and I'm laughing because it should be much more clear. What I did find was a DoD, DAU, at the DAU website, actually, Lois Harper, a former colleague of Don and myself, had been doing an interview of the current ASD. I think she's the ASDA. I'm not entirely sure. There's an org chart at the end, so we can look at least who some of these people are. But there was this clear, because it had reference in this, one of the slides showed DoD Directive 5135.02 and 5137.02, and then it had a little arrow to the DoD 5000.2. And so they're working on updating that 5000.2, but it's not updated yet. And so this slide spoke a little bit to how they're trying to rewrite the entire acquisition instruction, including like the entire 5000, milestone decision authority stuff, all at the same time, which would explain why they're so far behind on updating some of these other things. And it was confusing, but not, I guess it was, as confusing as anything ever gets in DoD, which can be quite confusing. It showed that in the 5002, they have like a new one and an old one, and their plan is to like cancel the old one as the new one comes up to date. So they kind of have like this map of how they plan on updating the instructions, but they haven't updated them yet. So they more or less just kind of have a map, and some of them are updated and some of them are not. Does that kind of answer your question? We only get to see Don's facial expressions in this video.
I think it's an
I'm not sure if you were directing your question at me, whether my question was answered or Don's question was answered. But and don't take this the wrong way. This is not pointed at you, Jennifer. No, that doesn't answer my question. It doesn't answer anything.
Well, I think it.
It goes back to what we started in the very first podcast. If you're a contracting officer in DoD, you may not actually need to know the FAR or the DFARs anymore. You just follow the instructions you've been given. No, I'm very dissatisfied with that answer, and it has nothing to do with you, Jennifer.
Yeah, I think that's an explanation. She gave a good explanation, but it's not a justification, and there is no justification probably.
Yeah, it's just taking a long time. I think that's really the bottom line, is they're trying to, in my opinion, they're trying to update way too many things at once. And so as a result, they have this really confusing situation where they've updated some of it, but not all of it. But yet the DPAP, which I'll show you the instruction for that, which is still the old one, is already operating under the new term and somewhat in the new structure. So it's quite confusing.
Right. Isn't there an acting director, or I don't believe the director has been confirmed, perhaps I'm wrong, but isn't there an acting director
Yes.
of DPC, which is what used to be called DPAP? Used to be under the US.
Yes, and in fact, the org chart, the last chart here will show who those people are. I think almost all of them are acting. I don't know that any of them have gone through any.
But this is understand. We're less than 100 days into the new administration. I get it. That's not a complaint, but officially, what authority do they have? Actually,
well, the DPC director is not a political appointee. So they don't need confirmation. And I don't know if he's interim anymore. I thought Tenaglia was permanent.
Right. Well, I don't know who the DPC is, because according to what I'm reading here, only the Director of Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy, or DPAP, has head of agency authority.
Well, let's press on, because I think some of these other slides will answer some of your questions. Okay. Yeah, so this was just as a point of interest, and I think it is a very pertinent point of interest. So both the in DoD Directive 5135.02, now this is the directive that assigns responsibilities to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. And this directive is signed off on by the Secretary of Defense or the Undersecretary of Defense, or Deputy Secretary of Defense. And so this is actually a very critical, these directives are much more critical, I think, than most people in DoD realize, apart from the FAR or DFARS, because in these directives is actually where authorities that are given to the Secretary of Defense are technically redelegated. So Secretary of Defense redelegates authorities in these directives, and you can actually see the authorities that are redelegated. Or the responsibilities that are assigned. So this USD A&S is supposed to be the senior procurement, not supposed to be, is the senior procurement executive in accordance with the statute, is the defense acquisition executive in accordance with the statute, and is responsible for the defense acquisition system. And they serve as the head of the contracting activity for all components or activities that do not fall under the authority of a military department or that have been provided statutory contracting authority. And so this head of a contracting activity, we'll talk about that shortly, because that is also an approval level position. But much of this is redelegable, and it's actually redelegated in many cases in these directives and instructions by being laid out clearly in the FAR or the DFARs, which I think is why I wanted to go over these slides, because that's where it gets a little more confusing. So go ahead.
Okay, that's really important. Let me ask this question, Jennifer. I'm an average contractor. I'd like to understand this. Where do I find these DoD directives? Is there
the
a
Washington
website?
Headquarters Services maintains a website titled the DoD Directives website. So if you just Google DoD Directives, Don, if you have a minute, if you can put it into the chat, that would be great. But you can look up all these DoD directives, and there's literally at least hundreds of them. I mean, I would have to say. I mean, it's some, and you know, even if you're not a DoD contractor and you're a DoD employee, it's very hard to, I mean, if you were going to try and read through all of these DoD directives or DoD instructions, you would have literally thousands of pages. I mean, because I'm nerdy, I tried to make it a hobby to read through many of them. Because there is acquisition or contracting policy buried in some really obscure ones, interestingly. And then, of course, some of them are classified, so you can only access them if you have the right clearance. But at least the main ones, like this one is readily available to the public. But that underscores why we're doing this podcast, is I think it's not crystal clear. In fact, it's anything but clear. I think it's very confusing, even when you've worked in the system for some period of time. All right, so this USD A&S, and this is very similar to the former AT&L. The AT&L was the head of the contracting activity for these positions previously, and was the senior procurement executive, et cetera. And so this USD A&S also, I picked select ones, but they exercise authority, direction, and control over the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and then the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisitions, that's that ASDA, and then that ASDS for Sustainment. And then I put in there for Nick's benefit, the Defense Contract Management Agency, and then also the President of the Defense Acquisition University. Those are through the ASDA, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition. And then there's some other positions that maybe establish it. They also exercise directive authority under the, good grief, I'm having a blank. The AEs is acquisition executives. What is the S? Why am I not remembering that? The senior, yes, senior acquisition executives. That last bullet there on that slide. It exercises directive authority over the senior acquisition
isn't that
executives.
service?
Yes, service.
Isn't that service?
You're right.
Okay.
So yeah, so that would be the Army, Air Force, and Navy acquisition executives, and the component acquisition executives for programs where they are the milestone decision authority or decision authority. And then advisory authority over the service acquisition executives for programs where the service acquisition executive is the MDA. So go ahead.
What is a component?
A component is a component. After we get into contracting activity, I think it will be a little more clear.
Okay.
Because I don't think it's,
I don't know, Don. I think she should have. Everybody knows what a component is. Um, but I do have a question. So you didn't have DPC or DPAP or whatever they're calling it this week on here, but I assume that the director of DCMA, who reports to the USD A&S, is equal to the director of contract pricing or pricing and contracting, who also reports to the USD
no.
A&S. Is that a fair assumption?
And I'll tell you why. I mean, it's not an unfair assumption. It's not inaccurate, but it's not entirely accurate. So, and let's go to the next slide. Okay, these are the contracting activities. And so these can be components. So contracting activities can be components, like you can be a component acquisition executive or whatever if you're the senior executive for a contracting activity. Although component is not defined in the DFARS, nor is it necessarily defined, I don't think, in any, it is defined in one of the directives, but I can't remember which one off the top of my head. So in the DFARS 202, it says a contracting activity is elements designated by a director of a defense agency which has been delegated contracting authority through its agency charter. So in DoD, which now this is the DoD A&S, has redelegated procurement authority, contracting authority to, these are your contracting activities that get their authority through basically the Department of Defense, which is at this point DoD or USD A&S, and which has been redelegated to DPC. So DPC is the basically kind of head of the contracting activity, more or less, for DoDEA, DHRA, Defense Media Activity, Defense Microelectronics Activity, and then they do the purchase card for the Inspector General of DoD, and then the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. So those are your kind of fourth estate contracting activities. So those are the activities above and beyond the agencies, the fourth estate agencies, which was DARPA, DECA, DCMA, DFAS, so on. So go to the next slide. That shows the Air Force. So the Air Force has a fair chunk of contracting activities. The next slide has your Navy, Army, and Navy. And then I fit all of the 18 defense agencies, only DLA has subcontracting activities. So DARPA only has one activity, DECA only has one contracting activity, but DLA has 5 contracting activities under it. So in all of DoD, you've got these, you've got the 18 contracting activities. Well, you've got 17 contracting activities associated with the defense agencies, and then 5 contracting activities under DLA, and then you've got the big 3, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and then those activities under DoD. So go one more slide. So contracting office, I threw this in here because I think this is also confusing, because a contracting office, this is defined in the FAR. It says contracting office means an office that awards or executes a contract for supplies or services and performs post-award functions not assigned to a contract administration office. The term chief of the contracting office is actually not defined in the FAR, but is often referred to as an approval level. And I gave an example there. So if you're reading the FAR and you see the term chief of the contracting office, it's essentially meaning an office that awards or executes a contract. And so go back a slide. So for example, we'll start with the Headquarters U.S. Army Contracting Command, which is the second one under the Department of the Army. That was my HCA, so to speak, when I was under the Army, and under the headquarters of the U.S. Army Contracting Command, they have contracting centers, which is like the Redstone Arsenal, the Rock Island Arsenal, the one in Maryland. I can't think of the name of it right now, but they have these large contracting centers, and these contracting centers might have 10 to 15 contracting offices. And then I was under the MIC, the Mission and Installation Contracting Command, which had 4 brigades. And in my brigade, there was 9 sub offices. So there was, approximately 30 offices under just the MIC, for instance. So even though you have these contracting activities, like the heads of each of these is the head of a contracting activity. With the exception of, if you go back to DoD, the head of the contracting activity for DoD, it's like, so the head of the contracting activity for DoDEA is not necessarily the head of DoDEA, it's actually USD A&S, because that's where they're getting their procurement authority from. Does that make sense?
So it's not DPC?
It flows through DPC, but no, because the DPC is the procurement head, but it's not the actual head of the activity. And this is something like, if you look at the DLA, for instance, the head of the contracting activity for DLA is not actually it's not the senior contracting person, it's the actual head of the activity. So it's the senior head of DLA. So whoever the commanding officer is for DLA is the head of the contracting activity.
Okay.
And so most of their authority is redelegable, and they will in fact redelegate it to the senior procurement contracting expert, but some of it is not redelegable. And that's why even in the Department of Defense, certain documents have to be signed but at the SecDef level, because it's not redelegable. So it's not even redelegable to the A&S. So it might have to be signed off on by every chain of command up to the Secretary of Defense. And interestingly enough, I witnessed that in Italy. It wasn't my action; it was a NAVFAC action. But there was they wanted to waive competition for public interest, and SecDef signed off on it. So when the situation is right, it's actually not that difficult to get that high level of approval. All right, so let's go ahead, because I know right now. In that particular case, it wasn't that long, and here's why. Because when the situation is right, it's actually relatively easy to get the approval. There's some strategic airfields that if the country that you're operating the airfield in doesn't want you to compete, then you don't compete, and the Secretary of Defense signs right off on that, because that airfield is so strategic that you have to, whatever that country dictates to you is what you do. And so, I mean, it wasn't easy, but it wasn't like if it was some really like far stretch or something, then yeah, it probably would never even get to that level. But when it's literally a matter of mission critical situation, it's actually relatively straightforward to get up to that level. All right, so let's go to the next slide. I think that's the contract episode. So let's go to the one after that. So this is the one that has not been updated yet. So it's Department of Defense Instruction 5000.35. which still actually has the DPAP language in it. And I assume it has to be on the cusp of being rewritten and updating it to the defense pricing and contracting. I will say, when I worked in the Fourth Estate at DoDEA, we got copies of every single update to every single Department of Defense directive and instruction, and we had to comment on them whether we wanted to or not. And so that's part of why these DoDs and instructions take so long, is because they go through every single fourth estate component, senior and the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. So everyone looks at them and makes their comments. So this is the some of the redelegations that have been given to. This is John Tenaglia now, so the defense pricing and contracting person. So even though it's using the old language, it's still the same delegations. So the director of DPAP, or now Defense Pricing and Contracting, under the authority, direction, and control of now the USD A&S, and in accordance with reference C, blah, 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 the statutes, is delegated all authority pertaining to DoD procurement vested in the USD AT&L or USD A&S by existing or future statutes and DoD directives, except for such authorities that cannot be redelegated. So this, Nick, explains why this DPC is above DCMA, at least in terms of redelegated authority. Does that make sense?
Well, I understand. Thank you. For the first time, I actually see something that explains something to me. You asked, does it make sense? No,
Yeah,
it doesn't make
and this
sense.
may change, actually.
But I see it and I understand it, and I thank you for it. I mean, none of this makes sense. None of this makes sense. How is a poor contractor, how is a poor small business supposed to figure all this out? It's not in the FAR, it's not in the DFARs, it's in some instructions that aren't even anywhere in any website that you'd think it would be related to regulations. You can't find it on acquisition.gov, right?
You got to watch
You got to go to
the
You
podcast.
have to know it's
Yeah, that's what I was
Washington
just going to say. That's why we're going through this.
I mean, gotta watch this podcast.
Well, and in everybody's defense, I mean, I have been working in DoD procurement at different levels and even at DAU for some period of time. And I think I was 16 to 18 years in before I finally started reading these chartering directives and finally started to see, this is where all this redelegation actually occurs. So it is not clear, definitely. All right, and then it also here in these redelegations says that they are going to act for the USD A&S in terms of administering the regulations, the DFARS, for example, and then acting as the head of the agency or agency head for DoD components other than the military departments for functions that are required. So USD A&S has redelegated some of that to DPC. So yeah, so HCA would in fact be, depending on whether it's specifically been redelegated or not, would be the DPC. But let's look at the next slide, because I think I give the DoDEA example. And I'll come back to this one. Flip ahead to where I have the DoDEA example. I think I just restate a couple of these. So go ahead one more. Yeah, so the DoDEA charter is DoD Directive 1342.20. And in paragraph 8.4, it says that the director of DoDEA's delegated authority to exercise the administrative authorities contained in enclosure 2. And so paragraph E2 says, hey, this is where they have authority to get supplies, equipment, and services to accomplish the mission of DoDEA. And then it limits it, to stuff that can't be redelegated. And then it allows the director of DoDEA to redelegate them as appropriate and in writing. And so to some degree, DoDEA has been redelegated. DoDEA was redelegated to you to exercise some HCA authority. But that's where it gets very confusing when you're in one of these fourth estate, especially activities, vice agencies, because you have to kind of figure out well, when do I send it to the actual DoD head to sign off on, and when do I send it to DPC to sign off on? And it varies depending on whether it's allowed to be redelegated or not. If it's not allowed to be redelegated, we would have to send it to DPC, who would then staff it up to, at that point in time, AT&L. All right, so go back to where I restated FAR 1.603. Yeah, this is what was very interesting also, is because agency heads are the only ones who can appoint contracting officers. And so in theory, all of the contracting officers at DoD could only be appointed by like Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy, because they were the head of the agency. So this came to light actually while I was working at DoD. And so my DoD warrant had to be reissued by then DPAP director Claire Grady. So it was just very interesting how, depending on how carefully you read things, you can say, oh, well, I guess the agency head is the one that does this. But it's redelegable. Certainly, it's not one of those things that can only be done. Otherwise, it'd be the Secretary of Defense signing off on everything. All right, so go down to the next one. Yeah, and then it's the agency head who establishes contracting activities and delegates broad authority. And so this is where all those chartering directives become very critical. And so all of these, especially in the fourth estate, these chartering directives become quite critical in terms of like what are all of these fourth estate activities allowed to do? Are they in fact a contracting activity? What kind of authority have they been delegated? Do they have authority to do? Almost all of them have been made contracting activities, but the IG, for instance, can only manage a purchase card program. So the IG actually decided they wanted DoD to do their contracting for them. And so they hired DoD to do DoD IG contracting. And Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy at the time had to approve that MOU, and they did. And so they can enter into these cross-agency servicing agreements as long as the appropriate authorities sign off on it. Did you say something? I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. When you say chartering directive, do you mean that there's an actual DoD directive? Is that what you're referring
Yeah,
to?
so like the DoD, if you go to the next one, that's where I give the number for the DoD directive. Yeah, so DoD Directive 1342.2 is the one that establishes DoD, and it charters DoD with a mission and a vision and, and responsibilities.
So is chartering directive like a technical term that applies to a subset of all directives or something?
No, I probably just use that term because in my mind it's like a charter. It's like an agency charter that kind of establishes you. And to some degree, the services like the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force operate on a similar fashion, but not as, I guess, well, just not the exact same as it does in DoD. But if you're looking through the list of DoD directives, you will see there's one for DARPA, there's one for DISA, there's one. So all of those 18 departments or agencies have a directive, a DoD directive that kind of sets forth what they're supposed to do and what authority they're delegated.
Okay.
And then let's go to the next one. I think that's the org chart. Yes, there it is. So I don't know if you can blow that up.
Let me see if I do this. Does that help?
Yeah. So
Okay.
there's the current performing. So she's acting basically. So Miss Stacy A. Cummings is the USD A and S. and her deputy is Mr. Greg Kausner, also acting. I think these are political appointees, and they are acting. And I think Nick made a very valid point earlier, which is it's not quite clear exactly what authority they have when they're acting, because I think there was a kerfluffle when I was working in the Fourth Estate, actually with the one who was over the Fourth Estate, or the DoDIA, which was the personnel and readiness, and he had signed off on a number. It was an acting person who had signed off on a number of policies, and then someone in Congress said, "You don't have authority to do that." And so, sure enough, it turned out that that all of those policies had to be rescinded. All right, and then this is the ASD for acquisition, Mr. Dyke or Dick D. Weatherington. And so this is the ASDA, and then under the ASDA, you can see is all these other sub-functions. And you can see John Tenaglia, the defense pricing and contracting there. And then now you see these little dotted arrows over to DAU and to DCMA. Why are they dotted? I don't know, because I couldn't find the current charters for these. And so I envision we're on the cusp of seeing the DoD directives that clearly spell out these relationships and current redelegations, but I couldn't find them on the website for these locations, nor are they on the DoD directives website. So I assume they're still being finalized.
I'm going to guess that part of DAU, like there's an assistant secretary for sustainment. So I'm going to guess they're dotted line to that person too. But maybe I shouldn't speculate.
Well, that could be correct.
Shouldn't speculate.
Oh, no, Nick, I was waiting for you to.
Go ahead. Okay, I was going to ask a question about Mr. Frank Kelly, acting president of DAU. How long has he been acting
like
president?
Maybe a year. But that's only because the president is temporarily working somewhere else. And he's supposed to come back and become president again.
Oh, interesting. Next question. We have a director of DCMA, Lieutenant General Bassett, I believe. And then we have a principal director of DPC. What's the difference between a principal director and a director?
Those sub offices have set themselves up. So under DPC, I know more about the organization of DPC. So under DPC, they have, for instance, like the person who's over the DAR council. So that's like and I think they call that person a director. So I think if they just pick their own titles. So I don't think it's an apples to apples comparison, if that makes sense. But this is where, Nick, I think that once we have the updated 5000.35 for DPC, and once you get the updated DCMA DoD directive and read through those, it should be much more clear, like how these organizations are structured and what their functions are.
Well, I'm crossing my fingers. I hope you're right. And it should just be a matter of, weeks to get the FAR and the DFARs updated as they need to be to match the titles.
Well, what I'd like to know is, what is this acquisition enablers? What does that even mean?
Directives, right? A couple weeks.
I mean, I saw that and I'm like, what? What is that office doing?
What struck me about this is like, wow, look at the diversity.
Oh, Don, nobody appreciates you stealing my sarcasm, okay? Nobody appreciates it. Yeah, this is clearly, Ms. Cummings, there's a woman in a leadership position, and kudos to her for that. But not exactly the model of diversity you would think would be a part of the new presidential administration.
Could be.
And
But
just a few
maybe
points of interest,
they're
like
picking based
the
on quality,
USD
right?
for R&E
Person.
now has all grants authority. And previously, yeah, and so
Oh, really?
previously all grants authority kind of, kind of in a strange way. I mean, there was a relationship with DPAP or defense pricing and contracting, and now it's split out entirely. And so just some, but the authority to do other transactions is still under the ASC for acquisition and sustainment. So very odd. I mean, I just find, there's just some oddities there.
Oh. Yeah, she was with
I'm old
Tenaglia.
enough to remember
quite
Eleanor
good.
Spector had a leadership role way back when. Yeah, but it wasn't even called DPAP back then, was it? I think there was acquisition reform that was in the name back when. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. But Don, I think your point needs to be reemphasized. This is not a model of diversity. It looks really, bad. And not that I'm impugning anybody's.
Yeah, I didn't mean to derail the discussion, but that it just struck me looking at the pictures.
It just looks bad. It's not consistent. 2001. No, I think that's a very valid point. It's not a model of diversity.
Well, it should be.
Maybe some of these positions. Well, no, I'm not going to even say that. I'm going to go back to the comment. I remember that many
John Tenaglia took over from a person who had been acting for 2 years, but before that it was Claire Grady, so it was a woman there.
Mm-hmm. And Jennifer is going to be it someday.
Right. So I mean.
Yeah.
Well, on the hopeful side,
is there more, Jennifer?
Actings. No, that was it. I again apologize that I could not be more clear on some of this, but it's because it's still being built, I guess.
So, how much has your knowledge increased, Nick?
Okay, so much. This has been great. Yeah. One thing I want to mention, since I'm bagging on diversity, we all know the new Secretary of Defense, right? You want to see a picture of the new Secretary of Defense? Can you show it?
Yeah, I think he was on 60 Minutes.
Forget everything I said. Talk about a leadership position, right? So you just take it up a level. It starts to look different. I guess I'll just leave it at that and not bag so hard on these unfortunate people who are in this picture. Yep. So, got to keep in mind that despite how it looks in one picture, if you look at the whole department as a whole, pretty good track record for diversity and promotion. But so this did kind of go a long way to answering my question that really started with when the DoD Inspector General criticizes the DCMA contracting officers and the contracting offices and the contract administration offices, which it turns out, oh, those are two different things. Why is it that you don't hear from the director of DCMA defending or taking appropriate action over the people that are within DCMA? Because you always hear, no, it's the principal director of DPC who's responding to those IG reports. And that always bugged me. I always felt like the director of DCMA ought to.
But we might see that change. I mean, we might see the response now be done by this ASDA position. It's just not clear. I think we'll see. I mean, my experience is that the DC, formerly DPAT, now the DPC, is very accessible to all of the Fourth Estate senior leaders, and so the DCMA director could very easily get into Mr. Teneglia's office, tomorrow to discuss DCMA issues or whatever. So I think I think they work very closely in those audit responses. So.
There's another relationship here, Nick, that might not be obvious, but like when we were at DAU, like different leaders within AT&L were called functional leaders, and they would kind of dictate the competencies that they wanted DAU to cover. So like for contracting, we would get our marching orders from the Director of Defense Pricing and Acquisition Policy, right? But for the logistics curriculum, they would get their marching orders from somebody who was like Director of Defense Sustainment or something like that. I don't know the exact title. But yeah, that's kind of a relationship that's not obvious here. Does that make sense?
No, that's very interesting. There's a lot of hidden currents here that I don't think very many government contractors or defense contractors would have a clue about. When every book you ever read on how to sell to the federal government starts with, here's a contracting officer, right? Make sure you check the warrant.
Right.
Well,
make
and
sure
Nick,
they have the authority.
It's not that obvious even when you work
and then
at
they move
DoD
on.
either.
They don't get into any of this level.
Basically, you just know who your boss is, and if you're lucky, you might know 3 levels above you. But how it relates at these higher levels is confusing to most people.
Right, but what I'm saying, Jennifer, is you're now positioned to write that book you need to write.
Well, how did
Well, that's all I had. Do you guys have any more closing?
No, but I mean, I'm serious. I am serious. I've got a lot of books on my bookshelf. I'm looking at one now called Contracting with the Federal Government. And there's a lot of introductory sessions for small businesses, who want to get started, who want to, non-traditional defense contractors is the current term. And, they're all looking for, who do I talk to? What's going on? And every book.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this was good. I learned today too.
Well, when they finalize.
I did know this at one time, but I
Yeah, well,
don't,
and that's
I
like when they
forgot it.
finalize these
And it's changed
instructions,
so
we'll
much.
have to do a follow-up. So,
Well, we could have thrown her.
Security
We
administration?
could have thrown her a curveball. We could have gone, do NN, what's that called? National Nuclear, whatever,
National
the DoD
Nuclear
component
Security
with
Agency.
of energy. What's it? What's it called, Don? Yeah, NNSA. Yeah, we could have thrown her a curveball. Hey, Jennifer, do that.
I think for a new student, it would be a good exercise to say, all right, starting with you, I want you to trace your authority all the way to the president, or
I would
to
ask
at
a
least the head of
similar
the agency.
question on interviews, actually. Now, these were for higher level interviews, but I would expect that someone should know their own like agency, like their own procurement authority. Um, but it was surprising how many people didn't even know where their own procurement authority came from. So
Did they admit that, or did it become obvious when they
um,
tried to explain?
both. I mean, some people would admit it frankly, and others would, try and explain, and and a couple people nailed it. So.
Well, I learned how to answer that question
Well,
in
I
this
wrote this
session.
whole point
I
paper on
would,
the
if you'd asked me
construction
that, I would have
issue, and I
said,
sent it
oh,
off
I just do
to
construction.
DPAP at that point in time.
And then I
And
would
their
have flummoxed
response
you.
was, huh, well, it probably doesn't matter because these other places do construction and it doesn't say anything about it in their agency charter. And I was like, I'm like, yeah, just wait until they totally mess something up and then the roof caves in and somebody dies. We'll see.
Oh, wait till there's a huge dispute like the A12 termination for.
Well, and construction is I mean, maybe we should make this a future topic and maybe get an
Right.
expert on it because to me, construction is very clearly, it's outlined in the statute. So it's not necessarily as, redelegable as it's not just as simple as like, oh, hey, this needs to be remodeled. So I'm just going to do it. But a lot of activities are out there just doing their own construction without being construction experts. And to me, that's very risky. But that is a whole other topic. So, yeah.
Want to sign off? Okay. Thanks again for
And I'll
joining us.
explore my